Welcome. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm Frances Stewart, and I'm co-chair of the Elders Climate Action Education Committee. I'm going to be joined shortly by Sam Ricketts from Evergreen Action. We'll be discussing how clean energy from clean power sources, combined with electrification of all our machines, buildings, and industries, ultimately cut 70 to 80% of our current greenhouse gas pollution in the United States. Now, Sam is running a little bit behind because it was a last minute change in his son's T-ball game. That's the reason I think we can all get behind. So before I begin our conversation with him, we wanted to start tonight's call by briefly spotlighting two important action opportunities related to electrification. One is the EPA's recently proposed new power plant rules, and the second is the IRA's tax incentives to electrify your home. Let's start with the power plant rules. Earlier this month, the EPA took a major step to reduce carbon pollution from power plants across the country through two vital rules that would set carbon pollution standards for new and existing fossil fuel plants under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. And as we know, fossil fuel plants are a top source of carbon pollution, and they are driving climate change. As part of the Biden administration's promise to cut carbon pollution in half by 2030, EPA proposed new carbon pollution standards for coal and natural gas-fired power plants will protect public health, reduce harmful pollutants, and deliver up to $85 billion in climate and public health benefits over the next 2 decades. Published in the Federal Register just today, the new proposed standards for coal and new natural gas-fired power plants would avoid more than 600 million metric tons of CO2 pollution, while also preventing 300,000 asthma attacks and 1,300 premature deaths in 2030 alone. This is a human health issue and is most harmful to those least responsible for creating the problem: low-income Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities who suffer first and most, and also the youth, our children and our grandchildren. As elders in our community and some families, it's our duty to express support for strong pollution standards to the EPA.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jen Chandler. I'm the director at Elders Climate Action. And as Frances mentioned, the comment period opened today. And so with public hearings announced for June 13th and 14th, and the possibility of a third day on June 15th, but depending on demand. You can pre-register to testify by sending an email to the EPA to sign up, and we're going to drop that email address and instructions in the chat. And there will also be an online registration form, but it is not available yet. So we'll add that to our newsletter as soon as it's available. We're expecting that the hearing is going to fill up quickly, so we encourage you to go ahead and pre-register now. The EPA really needs to hear from us. They need to hear from everyday people about how these standards are impacting our lives and our communities, and that we really care about the changes that are being proposed. Also, watch out for our June newsletter. We're going to have a simple sign-on comment that you can submit to the EPA in support of this rule. And that comment period will close on July 24th. So we'll be making that available through our website and through our newsletter and action alerts over that comment period. It's really important that we add our voice and ensure that this rule is strong and that it gets finalized quickly. Also, if you'd like to learn more about submitting comments on your own directly to the EPA, join Elders Climate Action and our Breathe Again collaborative partners. That's a group of 9 other organizations that we work alongside for a special training event, Your Voice Matters, EPA Rulemaking for Healthy Air, which is going to happen on June 14th at 3 p.m. This session will be a step-by-step training on how to find, draft, and submit your own comments to the EPA on a number of critical issues. There's currently a number of comment periods that are open at the EPA, including clean cars and trucks, heavy duty vehicles, mercury and air toxic standards, as well as the power plant rule. And so there's a lot of opportunity for us to give our input. We're going to drop a link to register for that event, that training event, in the chat also. And you're also going to receive all of these links that we're putting in the chat in the follow-up email that will go out tomorrow. So don't feel pressured to try to track everything that is in the chat or everything that we're mentioning tonight. And then also on the same related topic, we're looking ahead into July, which is 2 months from now. But I just want to put on your radar that we're going to be hosting Danny Hooper, who is also from Evergreen Action, the same organization that tonight's speaker, Sam Ricketts, is from. And Danny is going to discuss the importance of stronger regulatory standards to meet the Biden administration's climate goals. So don't miss that call. More information on that and the registration will be coming soon. So you'll be receiving things in your email about that.
Wow, a lot going on. So I'm Leslie Wharton. I have the honor of serving as chair of Elders Climate Action. And switching gears just a bit, Sam is likely to mention some of the tax and rebate incentives that are available through the Inflation Reduction Act, which is commonly referred to as the IRA. And typically here at ECA, we talk mostly about collective action, outreach to legislators, pushing for regulatory changes. But at this moment, with enormous amounts of funds going into the IRA to help people electrify their homes and engage in things that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we really have the opportunity to use our individual actions to power that renewable energy transition. So while there's still many barriers, and we'll continue to work on those barriers to accessing the rebates and tax incentives, the more of us that can take action by utilizing IRA funds to electrify our homes and help our communities move to clean and renewable energy, the quicker we will reduce those emissions and cut our dependence on fossil fuels. And by cutting dependence on fossil fuels, we basically cut the market power of the fossil fuel industry and really help move ourselves in the right direction. So implementation of the IRA is critical to its success, and we need to ensure that our communities are focused on that. In preparation for tonight's discussion with Sam about reaching 100% clean energy by 2035, we'd really like to get a sense of where you are in your electrification journey. And, there's no judgment here, there are no expectations, it's an anonymous poll, but we'd like to get some idea of where folks are and what they're doing or have done. And so I'm just going to pause for a moment. You'll see a poll pop up on the screen, and there are 4 questions. Take a few minutes to look at them and answer them, please.
And it looks like Sam just joined. Welcome, Sam. We're going to close out the poll. And Leslie will view the results with us.
All right. On the first question, do you know about the tax incentives available under the Inflation Reduction Act? 54% of you said you were aware, and 7% said you were not aware. And it's, for those of you who said you heard something about it or know a little, it is a complex area, and there's a lot of implementation regulations and things still going on. So that's great. On the poll asking, do you have any of the following? 18% have all electric homes. 43% of you are using solar panels. 30% have an EV. 29% an induction or electric stove. 39% a heat pump, and a fewer number, small percentage with heat pump water heaters or clothes dryers. For the next question, for those of you who participate in a renewable energy program like a co-op or community, 34% of you are getting your energy that way. And let's see, in terms of upgrades folks are interested in, 14% of you wanted to add solar panels, 41% want to purchase an EV, 21% recognize the importance of weatherizing your home, 30% want an induction or electric stove, 18% want to install a heat pump for heating and cooling, another 30% a heat pump for water heating, 9% have thought about it for clothes drying, and 9% of you are really thinking about converting to all electric. So those are big numbers, and if everyone out there sort of fit within those patterns of the percentage of people, we'd be well on our way to significantly eliminating greenhouse gas reductions. And then the last question was about using the tax incentives or rebate programs. Some of you were concerned because you're renters, and there are options for renters, but it's a little harder. Some of you live in condos or multifamily apartment buildings where it's a little hard to install. But it looks to me like many of you are eager to look at the options you've got and are waiting to find out more when the rebates begin and you can start honing in on them. So that was great. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it back to Frances.
And now we're very excited to welcome Sam Ricketts. Sam is a co-founder and senior advisor for Evergreen Action. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Previously, he led climate policy and strategy as climate director for Governor Jay Inslee's presidential campaign. In prior roles, he was the first executive director of the Congressional Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition and worked in the Washington State Governor's Office, the Democratic Governors Association, the Working Families Party, and in several federal and state campaigns. He's a graduate of Syracuse University and a native of Seattle, Washington. He currently resides in Washington, D.C. with his wife and children. And thanks again to Sam for giving us his time. And most importantly, we really want to know how your son's T-ball game went. So take it away, Sam.
Thank you, Frances. Thank you all for having me. I'm really pleased to get a chance to join you. And thank you for your patience as I closed out. It was T-ball. It's actually T-ball practice, but it had been rescheduled. I volunteered to coach my 5-year-old's T-ball team this spring, and it's no harder than advocating for climate action in Congress. I'll tell you that much. Sometimes they even do more. Sometimes they even listen a little bit better. These 5-year-olds, I tell you. I kid. I mostly kid. Anyhow, really pleased to get a chance to talk with you all today. I really appreciate you inviting me. Again, I want to express my appreciation for your patience as I joined you, and I'm looking forward to diving into a conversation together. What I'd love to do, I've got some slides, and I'd love to go through them. I think they're going to touch on things you already have probably thoroughly discussed, such as the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the key investments that are forthcoming. But I'd love to use the opportunity to touch on kind of like how and why we got here, and the opportunity we have before us in the implementation of these investments, and then in particular, what we got to do next. We, the collective of us all really that want to ensure we preserve a livable planet, that we who are in this movement together to build a more just and thriving and equitable and sustainable clean energy economy. As was just quickly foregrounding before I turn into my slides, I've only got a few of them, and I promise they're not too boring. I've even got a DuckTales theme. If you've got a DuckTales image or something. I will just further background on my role. So as was mentioned, my name's Sam Ricketts. I'm a co-founder and a senior advisor for Evergreen Action, which is an organization sort of created by the alumni of the Jay Inslee for President campaign that the governor, for whom I worked for over a decade, brought forward to the country in 2019 as part of his presidential platform, a robust agenda for how you actually visualize the real policies needed to achieve something akin to a Green New Deal. And when that campaign ended, as all but one did of the 25 who got involved in that race, we sought to bring that policy agenda forward through other means, and got a chance to work with President Biden's campaign and then his administration to bring some of this forward. Got a chance to work with Congress to bring some of this forward, and have since Evergreen has since continued those efforts. I encourage you to go to evergreenaction.com and get involved there. As well, I've also taken up a senior fellowship at the Center for American Progress, which is not a brand new organization we just created, but of course a 20-year-old organization founded by luminaries who work on climate, named folks like John Podesta a couple of decades ago to push forward a progressive agenda for the country, including around clean energy and climate action. And AmericanProgress.org is that website. In particular, my role at Center for American Progress has been about bringing the lessons and the progress of state climate leadership to Washington, D.C., and then making sure the progress that flows out of Washington, D.C. continues to support state and local progress throughout the country. All of this is all this to say, I'm a fellow traveler in this world that's trying to advance climate action wherever we can, however we can. And I'm eager to talk with you all about how we push that forward at the federal level, how we push that forward at the state level, how we push that forward at the city level, and we push that forward in the private sector. It is an all, as you all know, it is an all hands on deck effort. I hope I have returned.
Yes.
Pardon me, folks. Appreciate your patience. Without further ado, let me stop babbling and turn into my discussion. And I would love to go through some of what I want to talk about. It's going to be a recap of probably some of what you already thoroughly know about what happened legislatively and what's now happening through executive action at the states. And then I'd love to turn to a dialogue, especially if it's so what I'd love to do is talk with you about recent progress on climate action that's occurred in Washington, D.C. and throughout the country, and what federal policymakers, including President Biden and others, should be doing next. Do you have my slides there? I'm only seeing the one that says Elders for Climate Action.
Yes, we see your slides.
My slides. Okay, excellent. Okay, well, first things first. Everyone knows what has just occurred in Washington, D.C., but it's worth recapping because it's going to provide us the roadmap for where we go first, where we go next. IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, was passed by Congress and signed by President Biden in August of 2022. It invests approximately $370 billion projected federal outlays over the next 10 years and plus in climate, in clean energy, and environmental justice investments, coupled with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or bill, and the CHIPS and Science Act, or CHIPS, IRA, bill, and CHIPS, the three climate uncles. All told, it's about $500 billion in projected climate investments. But here's the kicker. There's the potential for much larger actual investment, especially considering so much of the money that flows in these investments is actually through the tax code, which is uncapped, meaning, as you were just discussing in your poll as I joined, it's actually there's an unlimited amount of money that could be spent through the federal government, namely through the tax code, on these investments. It's simply a matter of how much we can invest in projects that can take advantage of these federal investments as well, as Keanu Reeves would say. Whoa. This bill, or these bills collectively, are projected to help us hit an approximately 40% reduction in greenhouse gas pollution below 2005 peak levels by 2030. That is almost all, but certainly not all of the way towards meeting President Biden's commitment to a 50 to 52% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. Of course, this builds upon progress that's already been made to cut emissions by about 20, possibly 25% below those levels under our baseline already. Key elements of the Inflation Reduction Act in particular, namely clean energy tax credits that form the majority of the climate investments in these bills. Again, and those are projected as the majority. They could be already significantly more than the amount that was projected when the bills were passed, which was probably a pretty dramatic underestimate. There is also massively expanded financing programs, the Department of Energy, USDA, and EPA. There's major investments in environmental justice, significant investments in clean and low carbon manufacturing, a fee on methane polluters, $20 billion plus investments in climate smart agriculture and conservation, and notably, because we'll come back to this, significant investment in state and local led and community led climate leadership. This is all part of a new type of policy framework that's been advanced in Washington, D.C. and throughout the country that is no longer quite based on simply on top-down market mechanisms to incentivize emissions reductions or nudge the market towards emissions reductions. It is part of a new national paradigm commonly referred to as standards, investments, and justice. But notably, the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't carry a lot of sticks. It is really all carrots. It is an investment-led climate agenda that really importantly is going to need corollary pieces of it, complementary policy mechanisms in order to bear fruit when it comes to the things we're really going to need to meet this 40% reduction and to exceed it, to of course go all the way towards cutting climate pollution in half by 2030 and continue on that trajectory to reach net zero well before mid-century. I want to just recap a couple other things from IRA because it is so transformative, and not just because of the investments that are in the bill itself, but because what they need to unlock throughout the rest of the economy, especially with the things we all need to go do next. It's really helpful, I think, to break it down kind of sectorally. The power sector, which is, the main driver of decarbonization. It's been the one that we've made the most progress in certain ways because of the renewable energy that has been added to the grid, led by companies, led by state policy innovation, led by past federal investments, namely the investment and production tax credits for renewable energy. But the electricity sector features a solid 50% or more of the investments in the bills collectively, led by clean energy tax credits, but then some of those financing programs I mentioned earlier. And this is really important because, of course, we need to decarbonize the power sector, not just for its own sake. It's about a quarter of US greenhouse gas pollution. It's the second largest sector climate pollution wise in the economy. It's also the sector we need to grow dramatically. We need to grow the grid by, on some estimates, about 60% in the course of the coming decade, just to be able to add more clean generation that we can then use to electrify and power more of our home appliances, more of our vehicles, even parts of heavy industry. Other parts of the bill, transportation gets a smaller part of the Inflation Reduction Act, namely through the EV tax credits, but also gets a lot of investment through the other bills, most notably the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law. The building sector gets investment through all of the vehicles that we're talking about here, but especially there's some new DOE rebate programs for home energy retrofits and electric appliances. The industrial sector, which is sort of the often overlooked sector, unfortunately, because it is hard to deal with because there are so many subsectors that need to be decarbonized, some without technologies that we really have commercially available to us today. But it gets a lot of investment through these bills. $65 billion plus in the Inflation Reduction Act is really targeted at clean manufacturing, industrial decarbonization. A lot of funding also dedicated to agriculture and forestry and conservation programs. And then, so each of these sectors gets a robust investment through the Inflation Reduction Act. A couple other pieces of this climate, jobs, justice, standards, investments, and justice pie is, namely, for the first time, the Biden administration and Congress have prioritized environmental justice and equity with the investments made. $60 billion under some estimates in the Inflation Reduction Act are benefiting disadvantaged communities. Another $65 billion in the infrastructure law are targeted towards environmental justice advocate priorities. So a robust commitment to things like environmental justice block grants for community-led transformation, Superfund cleanup, clean water, port electrification, port pollution notably impacts disadvantaged communities, communities of color, low-income communities. And then also for the first time, a commitment to good jobs, clean energy tax credits tied to promoting prevailing wage and registered apprenticeship programs, as well as more domestic manufacturing, which of course supports more good jobs building things in the United States. I wanted to touch on these things because, as I know you have thoroughly discussed the Inflation Reduction Act in the past, but it is notable because of obviously what it's delivering. It's also notable because of how we got here, and it's notable about where we go from here. I like talking in terms of I use a lot of metaphors in my speech. I never used to use a lot of metaphors. When I worked for Governor Inslee for years, we'd go to an event and he'd say, "What's the metaphor? How can I explain this to an audience?" And I'd say, "Can you stop asking me for metaphors?" And then you get a little older and kind of like you become your parents or you become your former boss. Now I use metaphors in everything I do. The IRA STU, long-term organizing by climate, environmental justice, and labor advocates, state and local leadership towards 100% clean electricity and jobs and justice, scalable lessons from past federal policy, notably the Recovery Act of 2009. Clean energy technology costs have come down and the industries have grown, providing us with more political power to be able to advocate for these jobs and businesses that are here today. And then, of course, we would not be here but for the urgent ambition delivered by those who've been advocating for a Green New Deal over the course of the last 5 years. And all those things together kind of collectively delivered for us transformative climate legislation in the IRA, but also in these other bills, Bill and CHIPS. And I want to mention all this because I really want to talk about a couple of the other things that we need to be doing next year together. Of course, IRA and these other bills will deliver for us if these projections bear out, which is not a certainty, mind you, but if these projections bear out and all we have is modeling to help us guide our way, again, an approximately 40% reduction in climate pollution below 2005 levels by 2030. On the way towards President Biden's commitment and that international commitment, and more importantly than these political commitments, on the way towards meeting the science-based requirements that we've known about here, that we need to really be making robust progress this decade on climate pollution if we're going to really get to net zero and avoid the worst of the climate crisis. But we're going to need to have more action to close the gap. Here on the right side of this picture is total greenhouse gas emissions throughout the economy as of 2 years ago. As you see here, electric power, as we talked about, is a quarter of that. Transportation is the larger slice of the pie, where we're making some progress, not enough. Industrial emissions are 23% of our emissions, but they're going to, by this time next decade, are scheduled to be the largest source and are only growing in certain ways. And then buildings, commercial and residential, are actually increasing, and unfortunately in many parts of the country, including places where they shouldn't be. Agriculture makes up 10% of US emissions, but of course much more throughout the country, or excuse me, throughout the globe. And that means like we're gonna make progress in each of these sectors, some more than others through this legislative action, but we're gonna need to have other things too, namely 3 things: executive action, further action from President Biden in these next 2 years of his first term, and then more in the next term, state and local leadership, additional action, and private sector accountability. Quickly, on each of these topics, I want to just touch on them. Executive action. One, we need to have President Biden implement the IRA and defend these investments in Congress and see this thing all the way through to the end. If I was to leave you with nothing else tonight, I want to tell you that these investments are currently under threat in the debt ceiling negotiations in Congress. And it is not at all a certainty that we are not going to see a haircut in some of these investments. So if you're to take one thing out of this and this conversation we have together, although we may get to more illuminative things than me blabbering further on before the hour ends. But if you're going to take one thing, it's that these things could be in danger, and that capping the tax credits, repealing the $27 billion Green Bank or Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, these things have been what Republicans in Congress and others have called for, and they require some action to respond to. So contacting members of Congress, contacting the White House and say, no way, no how, is sort of what all of us should be doing. Indeed, I've been doing it along with colleagues. Also, the Biden administration is going to need to enact key standards that they are advancing now and some in the next term. Number one, right now, they need to finish the clean cars and clean trucks rules that they have released proposals around. They need to finish the carbon pollution power plant standards that they released just a couple of weeks ago and need to have finalized in the early months of 2024 in order to have those standards take effect before the end of President Biden's first term. They need to finish methane pollution standards for oil and gas operations. And then they need to start laying the groundwork for more standards. There is more that needs to occur through executive action, provided that we don't have a Congress that wants to work on legislative action, bipartisan legislative action for climate action soon. They need to start regulating building appliances for their NOx pollution. They need to start preparing to regulate industrial pollution, greenhouse gas criteria and otherwise with the Clean Air Act and other authorities this term and next. State and local action, I want to talk about this as well, because all of these investments need to be implemented by states and by cities and by community groups. And that requires attention. A lot of us have been focused on Congress, have been focused on President Biden and what they can deliver for us, but states and local governments have long been the true leaders in climate action in the United States. And they're going to require just as much, if not more, attention than we've given Washington, D.C. these last few years if they're going to do this work well. And that includes staying on your city council members, staying on your mayor, staying on your governors, your state legislators to make sure that they're paying attention to the opportunities available to them now with IRA implementation. Every state, Republican, Democrat, independent, and otherwise, should be trying to maximize for its companies, for its consumers, for its communities, the investments available to them under the Inflation Reduction Act and these other bills. There's also a set of standards that every state should be advancing. 15 states have passed a 100% clean electricity standard. About 5 or 6 have implemented California's 100% by 2035 clean cars commitment. A couple of states have passed a commitment to 100% zero emission appliances. This is the kind of leadership we're going to need every state to eventually take on sooner than later. And then, all of these states and these counties and these cities need to be committed to not just reducing pollution, but targeting those investments in the communities that need the most, and targeting those investments in a way that create good, family supporting, preferably union jobs, building the clean energy economy. And then finally, just like we need state and local action, we are all collectively going to need, especially over the course of the coming years where we may not see much more out of Congress, more private sector accountability. We need to all use our purchasing power, our voting with our feet, voting with our wallets, to make it truly unacceptable for firms to operate in marketplaces without a commitment to reducing their homegrown climate pollution. We don't have every tool available to us technologically. We don't have every tool available to us through policy. And we all need to be committed to the types of purchases that you already talked about with your poll, but also holding companies accountable to the commitments that they have made or they have not yet made to ensure that we're preserving a livable planet and we're building a more just and thriving clean energy economy, which of course we can. And I'll just conclude by saying organizing and advocacy, first with breakthroughs at the state and local level, have paved the path to this transformative moment we've just had in Washington, D.C. and throughout the country for progress on climate and jobs and justice together. And now we're going to need more of that. It's not like the job is done. We're going to need further progress at all levels of government in the private sector to ensure a livable planet and, again, a just and thriving clean energy economy. And with that, I would love to stay for questions and enjoy a discussion together. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much. We've got a number of questions. One is, how do you recommend the best way to get state and local governments to message about the IRA's benefits?
Gosh, it's such a good question. It really is the kind of the ball game. State and local governments are where to get engaged. State and local governments don't have a lot of capacity. I recorded a podcast with David Roberts a couple days ago on Volts. I'm sure you all listen to and read David, who's been a longtime luminary as a journalist in the climate sphere. State and local governments, we talked all about the lack of capacity that many of them face as they even try and staff up to take advantage of these investments. As with all things, the main ballgame here is engaging with your lawmakers, like engaging directly with the governor administration or the mayoral's administration or the county executive administration or commission that you live in, or your local legislative officials from those same bodies, state legislators, county commissioners, or county council members. Get engaged. Give them a call, say, hey, what are you doing to ensure that our state economic development administration, or our state energy finance administration is taking advantage of the new greenhouse gas reduction fund or of the DOE loan guarantee program with reforms that have just been made to make it more accessible to states. All of these things require us just to raise our voice and say, what are you doing? There's a panoply of things that each state or city can do. And if you want to learn more about like the specific policy recommendations or structural recommendations you want to recommend to them, I encourage you to go to americanprogress.org and check out the State Federal Climate Initiative there. I encourage you to go to evergreenaction.com, where you can check out, we've got a blog there about things that every governor and every state should be doing to take advantage of these programs. And those should be useful resources for you as you engage with those state and local officials. But of all things, that's like I mentioned, the first thing I'd suggest everyone do is make sure to contact your member of Congress and say, don't cut Inflation Reduction Act investments as part of this debt ceiling debacle. The second thing I'd encourage you to do is engage with your state and local officials and make sure they're preparing to help you and your communities and companies in your neighborhood take advantage of these investments.
Great. And please, everybody who asks questions, if you can put them in the Q&A, I'm most likely to see them there. There's a lot of concern about what do we do to get red states to effectively use the IRA?
Well, some are doing it, and that's what's really, that's what should happen. I don't want to overstate by saying it's exciting, but it is exciting. I think red, blue, and purple states alike and their leaders understand this is where the economy is going. And you see some of the major investments, actually the majority of the announced investments in things like manufacturing facilities are in fact being announced in many red and purple states and not blue states. And that's going to change the equation for some of these things. I think I don't want to sound trite or like I'm disregarding the question, but engaging with your legislators or with your county officials or with your city officials or your state officials is what's going to get them to understand that their people want this stuff. This is investment that's readily available to them. These are economic opportunities that are readily available to them. And state and local officials are uniquely responsive to the economic opportunities of whatever flavor that coming to their community. So I'm bullish on even the most strident anti-climate state and local officials being able to see this for what it is, which is a major economic opportunity.
Some questions about the electrifying your home and your transportation is complicated. If you're going to set priorities, what's going to do the most in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions? What's the most important? Where do you start?
For individual homeowners?
Yeah, for individual homeowners.
I would say the big things in each, a couple of different things. One, using your voice with your elected officials at the local level and the state level is the most important thing. It is really important that we all do our damnedest, excuse my language, our darndest to reduce our own footprint. But we also need to make sure that these are policy challenges and they're going to require all of these things becoming more accessible to everybody. And we can't always accomplish that just with our wallets and our purchasing power and our own day-to-day efforts. But we should all do the best that we can with our own day-to-day efforts at the same time. A couple different things. One, your vehicle. Transportation is the big one. Transportation and vehicles in particular are the most polluting part of, cars make up 60% of the transportation sector pollution, which means cars, the trucks and the SUVs and the sedans that we drive are the most climate polluting part of the most climate polluting sector of the US economy. So finding all the ways to reduce, if you have an internal combustion engine vehicle and you're not able to get an electric vehicle timely, by the way, those are much more accessible now under the Inflation Reduction Act. But if you're not able to get one timely, look for other ways to reduce your vehicle miles traveled. That's not always going to be possible for everybody with transit, with ride sharing, with biking and walking, but it is a step. Access to an electric vehicle is another step. When it comes to your own home, your own facility, there's been much discussion of stoves, and it's true that we should get away from gas stoves to zero emission stoves. I use an induction oven stove here. My wife's not as much of a fan of it. I am. We have lots of fights about it, but it's well worth it for the emissions reductions. That said, heating and water and space heating is much greater pollution. Maybe not for our lungs and like criteria pollution, because like in a kitchen, you're like breathing that stuff in directly, and it's nasty. My wife disagrees, but we have that fight daily. But water and space heating is really where we need to. Those things aren't cheap either, but that's where we really need to make the push towards induction or towards electric appliances. And then the other thing is, like, again, we can't solve all these problems with our purchasing powers, but we can make a difference. And the thing I mentioned about being cognizant of the purchases you're making and what types of companies you're engaging with, like so much. Companies are uniquely responsive. They know consumers want stuff that's not going to destroy the planet or the communities. And the more that you can show that wherever you go with all the brands you work with and don't work and engage with is important. But I'll end where I began, which is we're going to solve this problem with policy more so than with our individual choices, but we should all do both.
So other questions about the SEC's proposed ruling about how corporations are talking about their emissions and emission reductions. What do you think about that?
Oh, he's back.
I'm sorry, I'm back. These darn interwebs. I was being asked a question about the SEC's ruling on disclosure. Is that
Right.
where we're going? I'm sorry.
That's where we are at the moment. Thank you.
It needs to be stronger. This is again in a place where the SEC, like regulatory power, can push companies to focus on this stuff. It needs to be a lot stronger. This is a place where we need federal financial regulators to get further into the game on this stuff. They need to finalize what they've got, but it needs to become stronger because we need not just disclosure, but actual action from firms, especially these well compensated firms that can afford it, of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And I think for now, considering the draft is out there, we take what we can get, demand this, and pocket it and get more, especially as we move towards the second term for President Biden.
Great. So a few questions about the problem of balancing what we need for clean energy with damage to the environment in terms of we're reciting renewable projects and also the mining for minerals that we need for batteries and for other materials that we need. How do we avoid creating new huge problems as we solve these other problems?
Good question. It's a really good question. First thing is there are real siting challenges and permitting challenges to getting all of our clean energy built and our transmission built. And we need to be attentive to those, and we need to understand that things need to get built if we're going to save our planet. I know it's often thought of as construction of things and new green spaces being used for development is traditionally not been thought of as the environmentally responsible thing. I'm here to say that it is the only environmentally responsible thing to do now is to start building some stuff and to doing some more quickly. There's obviously, as with all things, there's balance between how fast we want to run through a community or a wild space with new development, but it's going to require trade-offs. It's going to require us to look to ways to streamline, particularly local and state policies around permitting and siting, even more so than at the federal level, which has gotten a lot of the attention. These fights are normally things get hung up on county laws and state laws, much so more so than federal laws like NEPA. And that's where we really need to make some reforms. And notably, places are doing so. New York is doing it. Washington State just made major breakthroughs these last two legislative sessions, led by my former boss, Governor Inslee. But we need to get comfortable with the idea that we need to be building more stuff. I will also say we also need to be attentive to the fact the other side is really good at weaponizing this. There's much discussion about how much it's going to take to dig up enough lithium for electric vehicles, or how much, which, by the way, like the amount of critical minerals we need pales in comparison to the destructive power of oil and gas extraction happening around the world, whether it's off of our coasts or on our public lands in America, or whether that's strip mining of Canadian boreal forests for tar sands, or whether that's destroying the Congo to get more oil and gas. And the other side is really good at weaponizing that against us. They know these things target particularly people who care about the environment or the climate. They know that destruction looks, we feel that uniquely, so they try to grab the anecdotes that hurt us. There's much discussion right now about how offshore wind might be killing whales off the eastern seaboard. While of course we need to be careful with all coastal development, especially around stuff that's going to come into contact with ecosystems. The fact is, this offshore wind development is not the thing that's hurting mammals on the Atlantic seaboard. And nor is it even any more dangerous than offshore oil and gas development. It's actually much less dangerous. But the other side is really good at quietly weaponizing these things against those of us who need and know we need to see clean energy development take place. So I encourage everyone to recognize it as such and not be. And when we hear of our colleagues and friends say, no, we can't have more electric vehicles. What about the mining? No, we can't have offshore wind. What about the whales? To arm ourselves with the ability to call bull crap.
So another concern people have is as we continue to electrify, how is the grid going to be able to handle all this?
It's a good question. It's the ball game here. I mean, the power sector is where I spend a lot of my time, and it really is like a dual challenge. We need to both decarbonize with the 60% of our grid right now. 40% of our grid is gas-fired power plants, and 20% is coal. Thankfully, that coal segment is shrinking, but that gas segment really isn't, not nearly as fast as we need it to. So we need to both cut into that. We've got 40% clean air generation, 20% nuclear, 20% renewables. And we need to grow that part of the pie immensely, especially with renewable technologies. And we need to do that. We need to also just massively expand the grid. There's only a couple ways to do that. It's permitting and siting, especially of renewables, but also of transmission infrastructure, which means we just need to expand the grid. And then, we need to have, thankfully, we do have smarter grid technologies. Electric vehicles can become, backup power plants for our house. That's helpful. But mostly it's just building a lot of clean generation, folks. Building a lot of clean generation, retiring the dirty stuff, electrifying things. It's literally how we have to save ourselves.
Mhm.
And there's no way out but through.
Mhm. What's the role of energy efficiency in all of this?
Energy efficiency is like, it fell out of vogue. People don't like talking about it because it's like energy efficiency is the thing you do when you don't want to do the other harder stuff. Energy efficiency is vitally important. The role of energy efficiency is central. It's been a huge place where we've made a bunch of the emissions reductions. Again, I mentioned the power sector has been a place where we've actually made progress. I talked about renewables. It probably wasn't fair to only pinpoint renewables. A lot of that has been the fact that we've made a lot of improvements with efficiency. And there's a lot of utility programs, a lot of state and local programs, a lot of federal investment in energy efficiency has helped us deliver emissions reductions because we're using less energy for power than we have before. So while we need to electrify, we also need to increase grid efficiency. We also need to get, energy efficiency will help us reduce things like industrial emissions, where we aren't going to have the technologies readily available to make further progress. And the thing about energy efficiency is, I think former Energy Secretary Stephen Chu said it's not low-hanging fruit. It's like fruit that's already on the ground. It's already here. I don't want to tell you the things that I still know that are energy inefficient in my own house because there are too much, we haven't all gotten to it. But that's a thing that we can all work on individually. It's energy efficiency improvements, and a thing that we can all work on and advocate for at policy level. And I don't want it to get lost because it often does in the movement purely around electrification now, is the central importance of energy efficiency.
Say a little bit about concrete. That's a huge source of emissions.
Yeah. So cement and steel production could each be, a high single digits global emissions reductions. These are themselves their own massive contributors to greenhouse gas pollution in the country. And this is going to be the unique challenge for the new coming decade and plus, is how do we get after these really hard to abate industrial sectors? And some of that's going to come from the new innovations we're seeing that the Inflation Reduction Act is going to spur. Some of it's going to need to come from additional policy action. I want to see some leadership from states who want to take the advantage of, hey, we're going to lead in the clean industrial sectors of the 21st century. I'm hoping we see some of that spurred by some of these Inflation Reduction Act investments. But we're going to need to see more action, more federal congressional action in the future, more executive action through things like EPA industrial pollution standards, and then other things too, like trade policy. I mean, one of the ways through this, the problem of the industrial sector isn't just that it's energy intensive, isn't just that there's technologies that we don't have yet. It's also that it's uniquely trade exposed. It's vulnerable. There are domestic industries like aluminum and steel that have already been bludgeoned by overseas competition, particularly where overseas competitors pay their workers less. So there's an actual an economic opportunity to onshore, reshore these facilities and these industries, these workers, if we build the clean stuff. We just need to see it as such. And that's going to take more policy, more federal policy, more state leadership for those who want to lead on this. I'd encourage, the thing that I feel guilty about not working with as much, it's not arguing with my wife about our induction stove. It's not the energy inefficiency of my own house sometimes. It's not, it's the fact that we all need to be spending more time focusing on how we decarbonize the industrial sector.
Okay. There's a lot of interest in new battery chemistries, like possible iron water battery. Where do you think that's going? Is it going to be viable?
I don't know enough to say. I don't know enough to be dangerous about any of these additional battery chemistry technologies. I will say I hear they're promising, and a lot of people making a lot of long bets on lithium right now, and for good reason. Like, lithium-ion batteries have become the battery du jour for so many of these technologies for EVs and otherwise. But I think, with the move towards zero-emission vehicles, electric vehicles, we're going to see more battery chemistries come online. And I think especially a lot of this comes down to the things you need to move with it, or the things you need to use it for. Residential and commercial buildings utilizing grids, like behind the meter grid storage technologies. And then of course, electric vehicles. Like, how can we drive the cars the Americans want to drive with a battery that's affordable to put in it? That's what's going to be dispositive. And that's all to say. It's a long way of saying I don't know, because I don't know enough about these battery technologies, but keep your eye on them. It'll be more than lithium that saves us.
And what do you think about carbon capture and storage?
CCS. It is like it gets a lot of attention, and is certainly a polarizing technology because of the fact that carbon capture doesn't capture many of the other dangerous and pollutants that come from combustion, specifically of fossil fuels. Fundamentally, carbon capture is going to be needed in order to make progress in some of the sectors that we need to, again, particularly the industrial sector. There aren't simply ways other than having some combustion in there, or having some processes that emit carbon and then capturing that carbon after the fact. That we're going to need CCS, and we need to get comfortable saying as much. That said, we're not going to need it everywhere. We're not going to need it in as many places as many people say we're going to need it. And there are certainly better technologies that we can utilize faster and cleaner and cheaper in order to make real progress reducing emissions. So I want to see CCS developed. I want to see it more readily available for industrial emissions in particular. And I want to see it not used at scale in the places that there are better alternatives.
Okay, I think we're coming up on the hour. Apologize to everybody whose question didn't get in. There was certainly a lot to say. You'll be getting an email on the next day or so with the recording. Sam, can we have a copy of the slides?
Yes, you can. And if I can, just one more plug to say, call your member of Congress, tell them not to cut the Inflation Reduction Act in this debt ceiling deal, because that wouldn't be acceptable. In fact, it would be deeply unacceptable. We should all say as much.
And that is an extremely important point. So thank you so much for making it. And thank you so much for being here. And we hope your son had a great T-ball practice. And,
thanks again for your patience.
And join us again next month for Intergenerational Month and our Children's Trust. And thank you, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.